Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our fourth webinar in our series, Putting Land Rights and Responsibilities into Practice. Welcome, everybody who's joining us. We have a few more people just dialing in. Whilst they're doing that, I'm just going to take you through our introductions. Okay, so first of all, I need to let you know this webinar is being recorded and you will be able to view it and share it from our YouTube channel very soon, along with the other webinars from this series. Thank you for the questions that some of you asked at registration. We will pick as many of these up as we can during the course of this afternoon. Please also use the Q&A function, which you'll find down by the mute button, to ask any questions during the session. We'll answer as many as we can this afternoon, but we'll collate all the questions and we'll write up the answers and share these with you after the webinar. We will also send you a short feedback form at the end of the webinar. Your feedback's really important to us. It helps us to plan what we're doing next and to make sure that we're giving you the answers that you need. So please do take the time to fill that in once you've got to the end of this webinar this afternoon. And those of you who are tweeting, please use the hashtag Land Rights and Responsibilities, which Kirsty will post into the chat box shortly, so you can copy and paste it from there. But first of all, I'm going to hand over and introduce my colleagues, and then we're going to do a quick poll.
Hi, my name is Kirsty. I'm Good Practice Advisor for the Good Practice team.
Hi, I'm Gemma. I'm the Good Practice Manager and I'm based up here in Inverness.
Thank you, Kirsty and Gemma. And now Kirsty is going to launch a quick poll for you.
Yes, hi. So it'd be great. What we do at the start of each of these webinars is to find out a bit more about you. These webinars, the format they're not hugely interactive. So this gives us a chance to actually find out about you, where you're from and why you're attending this webinar. So I'm going to launch the poll and we'll just leave it for a few minutes and let you fill it out. Okay, here we go. Up to 25 out of 50. Oh, well, this is speedy today. We'll just leave it a few more minutes. Okay. Oh, no, we're still going. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and let's find out a bit more about where you're from and why you're attending. Okay, so can everyone see the results? Okay, so looks like the majority of you today are beaming in from Edinburgh and the Lothians. It's a good spread like our other webinars from right across Scotland, which is great to see because our protocols are for landowners of all types and rural and urban too. So great to see. So yeah, Highlands and Islands, 23%. Brilliant. And let's see, why are you attending this webinar? So most of you, it looks like you work with people who own land and want to learn more, which is great. That's kind of reflects a lot of the attendees in our last webinars. Great to see some landowners joining us today, and a good chunk of you are interested in land reform. So thanks for joining us, and I'm going to pass you back to Helen, who's going to go over what the programme for today is about, and we'll get launched in. Oh. Helen, you'll have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Thank you, Kirsty. You can see that Kirsty is usually at At this end, we've swapped roles today. So yes, I'll quickly take you through the programme and tell you what we're going to be covering this afternoon. So the main part, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. Now, some of you who've attended our previous webinars may have heard this section already, so you have 5 minutes to go and top up your cup of tea or mute, but please be back by 2:15, because then we're going to talk to you specifically about our new protocol on good stewardship of land, and then we'll take questions and answers for about 10 minutes once we've spoken to you about the protocol. We'll finish off, we'll give you a quick update on our work on regional land use partnerships, and then tell you about some opportunities that you have for self-assessments on land rights and responsibilities, and also our in-house online training workshop offer. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Gemma, who is going to talk to you about the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement and our Good Practice Programme. Thanks, Gemma.
Okay, I'll just wait. Once the slides are changed, I'll get going. So today, as Helen's mentioned, we're going to talk about our work on protocols, which is part of our Good Practice programme, and that is underpinned by the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. So published in 2017, the statement sets out a vision and principles for land use, ownership and management in Scotland. Land plays a central role in tackling some of the key challenges that we face in Scotland, including social and economic inequality, the climate emergency, and now our post-pandemic recovery and renewal. So land rights and responsibilities are about owning, managing and using land in a fair and just way that benefits everyone in Scotland. So as I mentioned, there are principles that are set out in the statement, and we have used these as the basis for the protocols that we've developed. So really the principles around land rights and responsibilities are that the overall framework should promote, fulfil and respect relevant human rights, contribute to public interest and well-being and balance public and private interests, that there should be greater diversity in ownership and tenure, and more opportunities for community ownership, that there should be high standards of land stewardship, that's principle 4, and that's what we're focusing on today. That there should be greater transparency around land ownership and use and management, and that there should be greater community engagement in decisions relating to land. So I'll move on and tell you a bit more about our Good Practice programme. So this is a programme that we launched last year, and a key part of this programme is that we work with a Good Practice advisory group. So the members of that advisory group are drawn from key sectors relating to land. So we work with NFUS, with Scottish Land and Estates, with Community Land Scotland, Development Trust Association for Scotland, the Scottish Property Federation and Scottish Environment Link. And they were all instrumental in helping us to develop these protocols, providing really helpful feedback and shaping what's in them. So we've touched on protocols, and along with the protocols, we also produce guidance that gives you kind of practical ideas and support to help you put the expectations into practice. And we also take on some casework and respond to inquiries that relate to the expectations that we set out. We also have a programme underway looking at land rights and responsibilities self-assessments, and Helen will talk to you in a bit more detail about those later. And we have a training and development programme that we're working on, and obviously we've got a few returners here, so some of you will be familiar with the webinars that we've been running. Prior to lockdown, we were doing some in-person workshops, looking at particular issues around some of the principles and some of the protocols that we've developed, and we have now moved those online, and again, you'll hear a bit more about that later. So moving on, a bit about what the protocols are. So really these take the principles and take the information that's set out in the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement and we look at what good practice looks like in relation to those. They set out practical expectations for interested parties, and really it's about clarity of expectations and about supporting all parties to take a fair and reasonable approach. And it also offers us a way of gathering evidence, understanding issues a bit better, and it can give a bit of an accountability mechanism. But in general, we find it's a really good way of raising awareness of land rights and responsibilities and how those apply in different settings and different sectors. So we move on, we've got a slide and we'll set out for you just what we've published to date. So I'm sure some of you will be familiar from previous webinars or from previous interaction with our work. So our first couple of protocols were on community engagement, which we published in January 2019, and transparency of ownership and land use decision making, which was published earlier on this year. Those two form the bedrock for the protocols, and all of the other protocols do make reference to them when we set out the expectations. So we do say that we expect for all protocols that people do meet the expectations of community engagement and transparency. And then we move on to some more specific protocols. So we have land ownership by charities and land ownership by private trusts, which go quite nicely together. And they relate to, the private trust relates to some specific issues we were asked to look into by Scottish ministers, and on the charities one we worked with Oscar to develop that. Those of you who joined us last week, it seems like a lifetime ago already, will have heard about our diversification of ownership and tenure and our negotiating transfer of land communities protocols. They relate to principles 2 and 4 of the statement, and as I mentioned, good stewardship of land, which relates to principle 4, we'll be talking about today. So I think I'll hand you over to Helen now.
Thank you, Gemma. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background to our most recent protocol on good stewardship of land, which is hot off the press. This one was just published last week, so a very new protocol, and lots of really interesting stuff in it. It was a fascinating one to develop. So this protocol supports principle 4 of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement that Gemma was just talking to you about. And that principle says that the holders of land rights should exercise these rights in ways that take account of their responsibilities to meet high standards of land ownership, management and use. Acting as stewards of Scotland's land resource for future generations, they contribute to sustainable growth and a modern, successful country. So this is the final of the series of 7 that Gemma mentioned, and but neither this protocol or the principle that's in the statement sit in isolation. All the general themes in it contained exist already elsewhere, although it's the first time that they've been drawn together in this way for all landholding interests, regardless of sector. We know a huge amount of good work is already going on, so the protocol hopes to support that, but also to provide guidance for people on what the expectations are across this broad range. So several other interlinking strategies have also informed the expectations. And I'll talk about a few of those just now, just to draw out some of the context for this protocol. So there are 3 highlighted here, which are the main ones that we've drawn from, along with the guidance in the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement itself, which itself draws again from some of these other strategies. And many of you will be familiar with at least some of these, we know. But for those of you who are less familiar, just to give you a little bit of background on what these are and what they do. Scotland's land use strategy, first of all, is a key commitment of Section 57 of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009. And we're now on to the second land use strategy, which was published in 2016 for the period up to 2021. So the land use strategy sets out a long-term vision. It has 3 objectives that relate to the economy, the environment, and communities, and principles for sustainable land use to guide policy and decision making. The land rights and responsibilities statement principles broadly complement those of the land use strategy, and where appropriate we've drawn from the earlier land use strategy principles as well to guide the tone of the expectations set out in this new protocol. Scotland's environment strategy provides an overarching framework to bring together strategies and plans for tackling issues such as greenhouse gas emissions, developing a circular economy, tackling waste, improving air and water quality, and progressing action on biodiversity. It also identifies new strategic priorities and opportunities and provides guidance on protecting and restoring Scotland's natural environment and striving to live within our planet's sustainable limits to help support well-being of people in Scotland and also to strengthen our economy. The strategy contains activities for its 5 years duration, which the current duration is also 2016 to 21, including themes such as agriculture, Scottish Rural Development Programme, forestry in the uplands, as well as land use decision making at a local level. The third piece of work we've referred to on the slide here is the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, and expectations relating to vacant and derelict land have been informed very much by our own research and work in this area and our involvement with the task force. Scotland currently has 11,000 hectares of vacant and derelict land across 3,700 sites. So that's roughly the equivalent to twice the size of Dundee, or those of you of a sporting mind, over 9,000 football pitches. A register of disused property was set up 30 years ago, and lots of great projects have reused land productively, but the total area of the register has barely changed in that time, and we're now working with partners to start to make inroads into that. So our research at the Commission has clearly shown that vacant and derelict land, whatever the size, affects communities and their potential. Over time, it can damage an area, resulting in social, economic and environmental harm. But the sites do also present opportunities for long-term regeneration and renewal, unlocking growth, reviving communities and reducing inequalities. So in addition to these key strategic documents and work streams, we've also drawn from intended outcomes from other key pieces of work, such as the Place Principle, the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, and the 4 environmental principles enshrined in the current EU articles that are the basis for much of our legislation in Scotland, and which the Scottish Government currently intends to include in any future duties. So they are the precautionary principle, that means the absence of full or scientific certainty is not a reason to postpone measures to prevent an environmental threat. The polluter pays principle, that the polluter has to pay for the cost of pollution control and remediation. The prevention principle, that mitigation means we can avoid environmental damage in advance. And the rectification at source principle, which is that action should be taken to rectify environmental damage at source. So all these pieces of work have, along with the land rights and responsibilities statement itself, have informed the expectations that are set out in the protocol that we launched last week. So the protocol doesn't override or replace any of that, but it does replicate some and draws together the behaviours and the culture that's expected to support practical delivery of good stewardship of land across all sectors and in all areas of Scotland. So how to define good stewardship over such a broad range of interests. In this protocol, when we talk about good stewardship, we mean the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So for land activities, this comes down to 4 essential points. So the first is that when decisions are made about land use and management, the potential harmful or negative effects on the environment and on people are considered, and the efforts are made to minimise these. When decisions are made about land use and management, the scope for achieving wider public benefit should also be considered. And we'll come on to talk about what we mean by public benefit in a moment. The third is that when decisions are made about land use and management, the potential harmful effects or negative effects on the environment and other people are considered and efforts made to minimise these, and that decisions talk about the scope for wider public benefit. So talking about public benefit, in this context, we're talking about providing wider benefits beyond individual benefits, such as the examples that are mentioned on the slide here, which come from the Land Rights Responsibilities document itself. So there are many that we can draw from, including provision of food, timber, environmental management, conservation, and also more urban or built environment benefits such as land for housing, commerce and industry. We've taken the definition of sustainable benefits that meets the needs of present communities without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we've set out the purpose of planning as set out in the current national planning framework, as managing the development and use of land in long-term public interest, which contributes to sustainable development or achieves national outcomes. Some of the other terms that we use in the protocol include productive use, by which we broadly mean opportunities to use or reuse land in the broadest economic, social or environmental sense. And it's important to note here that that is in the broadest sense. So in environmental terms, for example, that may mean no use of land if the long-term aim is restoration of landscape or habitats, for example. It's important to recognise that stewardship applies to the built as well as to the natural environment, and we also talk about quality of places to live and of particularly limiting the impact of vacant and derelict land. And principles also enshrined in the National Land Use Strategy from which these definitions are drawn. So having set some of the context, I'm now going to pass you back to Gemma, who will talk us through the particular expectations in this protocol. Thank you, Gemma.
Okay, so the expectations that we set out here. What we do is we ask that people demonstrate the following behaviours while pursuing their own land management objectives. Owners and managers of land should take and implement decisions in ways that support good stewardship. And they should take appropriate and proactive action to promote good stewardship. We say that owners and managers of land should consider if land and buildings are being maintained and used in a way that supports sustainable development, if they're being managed in a way that contributes to governance and to management objectives, and whether there are any opportunities there to make more productive use of land. So we recommend that regular kind of review is part of usual business planning, and it is something that a lot of landowners will be doing anyway. And then in terms of the long-term impacts of land use and management decisions, we say that owners and managers of land should review long-term social, cultural, environmental and economic impacts of decisions about land. So really it's about balance. And we recommend reviewing the capacity of land to sustain the benefits it provides, and the delivery of public benefits, and any cost-effective preventative action that can be taken to avoid environmental damage. So moving swiftly on to the next slide. Where land is highly suitable for primary use, so for example, food production, flood management, water catchment management, or carbon storage, this value should be recognised in decision making, and that in those decisions, any impact on the environment and community should be taken into account. We recommend that action is taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with land use, and that owners should review the likely impact of management practices and changes in management on biodiversity. And the final one on this slide is that we recognise that outdoor recreation and green space are really important contributors to our health and well-being. So the creation of publicly accessible green spaces is recommended, especially in areas where people live. And it's very important to note that everyone who owns, manages or uses land should act responsibly and be accountable for their actions. And then we move on to the next set. There are 4 slides here, so we're on slide 3 or 4, so it does seem like a lot, but they do all tie in together and really complement each other quite well. So in terms of wider scale strategic land planning, it considers and it contributes to broader sustainable development and delivery of public benefit, and it's a really important part of managing Scotland's land for the future. So we recommend that landowners and managers take part in these kind of planning processes and consultation, either through direct involvement, through local groups, or through involvement with membership organisations. Then we recommend that landowners should develop proactive estate management strategies that identify any property at risk of becoming surplus to requirements, and that they take steps to reduce the likelihood of a site becoming problematic. And in line with that, where land is causing demonstrable harm, owners should work with stakeholders to examine options for restoring them to productive use, whether that is social, environmental or economic. And in line with that, where any property does become vacant, owners should take action to ensure that a site is maintained in reasonable condition whilst awaiting reuse or development. It is completely inconsistent with the principles of good stewardship for any site to be allowed to become derelict and to become harmful to a community. Obviously, in some cases, there can be longer term plans, there can be things that are quite strategic and will take a bit of time to develop. So in those cases, we recommend that landowners consider whether there are any suitable interim uses that could be pursued, either through leasing, partnership working or collaborative working, something that could bring benefit to the site in the shorter term while the longer term plans are developed or funded or pursued in some way. And finally, we state that owners of land should avoid taking any steps that lead to land being declared ownerless. So, for example, winding up a company that holds title to land without transferring the title to another person or another entity. So that is the expectations, and that brings us on to the question and answer sessions. So I will hand over to Kirsty, who will host this part of the webinar.
Thank you, Gemma. That was a really good run through of our new protocol and all the different kind of strategies and information that went into drafting that with our Good Advisory Group. So question answers we've had. Thank you everyone for posing your questions on registration, and I think what we'll do is we'll go through these questions first, and I see that there's a few questions being posted on our question and answer board, but please, if you have any burning questions, post them now and we'll hopefully work through them, get to work through them. If we don't get through them all, we will be writing up a report about the webinar and share this with you afterwards. So the first question that was posed upon registration, and this one's for Helen, is: do you hope that this protocol will replace the current EU good agricultural and environmental conditions requirements within the Scottish Rural Development Programme, or is it written to complement them? And that is for Helen.
Thanks, Kirsty. It won't replace any existing regulations or requirements. The protocol itself isn't detailed enough and doesn't replicate or replace any of those regulations or requirements. The Scottish Government will be looking at how the EU conditions are replaced, and we have heard that they do intend to replicate the core principles that are there within the existing EU principles. The Scottish Rural Development Programme and all the other strategies that we've referred to set out the specific guidance and expectations in much greater detail and with input from experts in that particular sector. The duties are designed to protect people and to protect the environment. So our protocol supports that by supporting the positive behaviours by everyone involved, making sure mutual interests are taken into account in a reasonable and fair way, and that long-term use and management take those broader public interests into consideration. So the Good Practice Advisory Group, who worked with us to develop the protocol, includes representation from a really wide range of sector bodies, and we would encourage all sectors, not just in agriculture and environment, but all sectors who make land-related decisions to work with us and their sector bodies to develop the expectations in the context of their own work and guidance. And we're working with a number of sector bodies to take those forward, and we hope that these will help you to frame those if relevant to your own sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. The next question that we were asked upon registration was: how well defined will environmental good stewardship be? Is it just looking after the environment, or will it be more specific in terms of greenhouse gases, wildlife, and air and water pollution? And I'll pose that one to Gemma.
Sure. Yeah, as I've mentioned, talking about the expectations there, the protocol looks for the impact of long-term use and decision-making on the environment, along with other social, cultural and economic impacts. So we encourage landowners to consider the long-term environmental impact alongside their own management objectives, and to consider the capacity of land to sustain the activity for the longer term. For more detail in terms of Scotland's environment strategy, which Helen mentioned earlier, that provides an overarching framework that brings together strategies and plans for tackling issues like greenhouse gas emissions, developing a circular economy, tackling waste, improving air and water quality, and progressing action on biodiversity too. So that strategy provides guidance on protecting and restoring Scotland's natural environment, and striving to live within our planet's sustainable limits, and that's to support the well-being of the people of Scotland and strengthen our economy. So the protocol supports the behaviours that are set out in that strategy, and the strategy provides a lot more detail on that.
Perfect, Gemma, thank you. Okay, one other one that's come in, and this is for Helen. Will there be a priority in land use for farming activities and people rather than commercial forestry, for example?
Thanks, Kirsty. That's a really interesting question, because there are lots of potential uses for our limited land resource in Scotland, aren't there? The protocol says that the value of primary uses of land, such as food production, flood, water catchment, flood prevention, carbon storage, should be recognised, and that the impact of relative options on communities in the environment should be taken into account. We don't state in the protocol, and it's not the Land Commission's role to state what the particular land use should be in a local area. Both nationally and locally, there'll be lots of policy ambitions, and with the immediate post-COVID economic recovery and climate change emergency increasing urgency for delivery, it's not always easy to reconcile all the competing demands and choices that we have. But one of the things we'll talk about towards the end of this webinar is to give some information on our work on regional land use partnerships, which our colleague Harriet is leading on. We've been asked by Scottish Government to provide advice and make recommendations for the establishment of regional land use partnerships to enable more collaborative approach to land use planning across all of Scotland, with clear focus at a more local level on action and delivery. So some choices will be made at local landholding level, and we expect them to consider the implications for others, and for those decisions to be in synergy with local and regional strategies as far as possible and as they develop.
Brilliant, Helen. What I'll do, Graham's actually posed a question in the question and answer box, so we'll go on to his question and then we'll come back to some of the pre-asked questions. So his first question was, do the protocols consider obligation of tenemental proprietors to steward their properties so they are not a blot on the townscape? As councils own a lot of these and many are not stewarded well, is the Land Commission considering an independent authority to enforce good stewardship? So I'll pass that one on to you, Gemma.
Sure. In terms of tenement proprietors, it's not something we specifically reference in the protocol or in our supporting documents, but it is an issue we're aware of. The Scottish Government had a working group looking at tenement conditions and maintenance, and they published a report, I think, earlier on this year on their work plan for that. Something I know the Built Environment Forum for Scotland have been involved in, so it's not something we have specified, but you know, as we've set out here, we do expect that the maintenance and kind of stewardship of land and properties is on an ongoing basis. And in terms of local authorities, we are not considering an independent authority to enforce good stewardship. I'm sure we've mentioned in several of the webinars, but maybe not touched on it today, that these protocols are voluntary. We are asking people to demonstrate, to follow the expectations and to demonstrate good behaviour, and we're using these as a way to set out clarity of expectation. But there is ongoing work in the Commission. It is something that we'll look at as we gather evidence, whether there is a need to make recommendations or proposal on powers on a statutory basis, similar to what we have with the Tenant Farming Commissioner.
Thank you, Gemma. I'll focus on, there's a few more questions being posed. So the first one, which I think I'll pass on to you, Helen, is what incentives are being provided for landowners to change or optimise their land management? It seems that there are plenty of recommendations and aspirations, but few obligations or incentives. Maybe just go on a bit talk a bit about how the protocols are voluntary, but what the long-term aspiration is of the Good Practice programme.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. And yes, at the moment the protocols are voluntary, and as we've said at the beginning, a huge amount of good work is already being done to deliver good stewardship in both the public and the private sector. We're working to try and clarify what the expectations are across a really broad range of interests and broad range of circumstances, as you'll be getting a flavour of here. So the incentives are many. I mean, the incentives are for the well-being of society, for the well-being of individual communities, and also for the well-being of individuals. In the longer term, there are a number of things that we're looking at the Land Commission. We've mentioned the regional land use partnerships that we're advising government on at the moment, which will potentially have powers around some allocation of funding to help direct how land is used in different areas. We're also developing research around the benefits and developing tools to help in more built-up areas to people to identify the risks associated with vacant and derelict land and how that land can be brought back into production. The protocols provide a framework for us as well for people to bring forward examples for us of where things are going well, and it's really, really important that we hear that and that we can share those lessons, but also to let us know when things aren't going so well and when the expectations aren't being met, because that evidence helps us to identify where further research is required, or to inform any recommendations that are made to ministers in terms of future regulations or statutory implements that are going to be required to take things forward. And I know there were a couple of questions around land value and land valuation as well, which again we've more work coming up on that, so we'll maybe move on to those shortly.
Okay, so I'll move on to Nim's question. Thank you, Gemma. So this is about, there's a scrapyard with contaminated soil in a small town I work with. Is a source of potential pollution. The community is interested in purchasing the land. What is the first steps for the community here? So you'll see the wider questions. So Gemma, do you want to answer Nim's question?
Sure, yeah. I guess there's a few things to consider there. I mean, in terms of the contamination and the pollution, you know, it could be that there's an appropriate regulatory body that could be approached about tackling that. It's an interesting issue when you mentioned that the community are interested in purchasing the land. We do have resources that we've put together through our vacant and derelict land programme of work. So we have a tool for measuring the consequences of the vacant derelict site on the community, and we also have some information online about funding sources that are available for tackling vacant and derelict land. And for the community, it would be important to have a group who can take forward purchase. You know, you might be familiar with Part 3A, Community Right to Buy registration for abandoned, neglected and detrimental land. It's certainly not a first port of call. You'll be asked as part of that process to demonstrate that you've already taken steps to purchase the land. So really what we need to do is get community group together, speak to the local community about their needs and their priorities for the site, and look at whether purchasing is the best outcome, whether there are other ways you can tackle it through working with other bodies, coming up with some sort of partnership arrangement, or working with the landowners themselves. So it's in terms of community ownership, it's difficult, and without knowing more about the community itself and whether there's an existing group there, there might be bodies that could help you. In the Highlands and Islands area, we've got Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Community Land Scotland work with community owners and aspiring landowners. South of Scotland Enterprise has recently been established, and Development Trust Association for Scotland also do some really good work in supporting communities. So I think that would be really getting the communities together, talking about your needs and your priorities, and identifying the kind of best source of support for you.
Thank you, Gemma. Okay, I'll move on to Paul's question. I'll pose this one to you, Helen. Land for the primary purpose of producing food will not be protected if the value of land for housing is considerably higher than agricultural land. Scottish Land Commission should be working to protect good agricultural land too. Can you influence planning legislation to do this?
Thanks, Kirsty. That's a really interesting question, Paul, and one that comes up in lots of communities that we're speaking to, and there are some very big and challenging issues wrapped up in your question there. One is around planning and how long-term decisions about what land use is going to be, and the other one is about how land is valued. Both of those are really big issues, but important issues. We've touched on the work on land use partnerships already, so and I'll come back to that again in a few minutes, so I'll not dwell on that. But and I think there are important issues as well about the value of land, both in agricultural and environmental settings, but also in urban areas as well. And some of you may have seen a blog series that we have on our website at the moment about building back better and about our post-COVID recovery, and a really interesting debate about how land can be used better in the new situation that we're moving into. So there are lots of pieces of work, there are lots of really fascinating debates starting to happen around this, which we're pleased to be part of and leading a number of them. Part of that will be rethinking how the tax system operates and about how land is valued and how we can incentivize landowners to repurpose or to use any land, whether it's in a rural or an urban environment, to support wider public benefits. So part of that is needing to make sure planning policies and regulatory frameworks are agile enough to support that transition, and about finding ways for pooling resources and expertise across the public sector in service of more effective delivery. So we won't be doing that on our own. The Land Commission have an important role to play there in facilitating those discussions and in leading them and coming up with advice and recommendations for the policy makers. And there'll be a lot of work happening over the next 18 months around exploring the financial aspects and tax systems. So I mean, do keep an eye on that, because there will be lots of opportunity to get involved in those discussions and to put thoughts forward to us to inform any recommendations that we make over the next year or so. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to check in with Helen, time-wise. What are we sitting on? Have we got time for another question?
I think we would have time for one more probably, and then we'll need to move on, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'll move on to Grace's question. I guess we maybe have covered this, Gemma, but how can members of the public raise issues of stewardship to public bodies, is what she's trying to ask in that question.
I think in terms of that question, if you're aware of the ownership of the building, it would be making contact, communicating with them. Now that we have the protocol published, that is there to share with them. It applies equally to public bodies as it does private landowners. So that could be used as a framework for a discussion. And obviously with local authority, you will have your councillors there, your local representatives, and you could always approach them with any particular issues that you've identified.
Perfect. Okay, we'll wind this up so we can get through the next slides, but thank you everyone for posing your questions. There was a few pre-asked ones as well which we didn't get through, so what we'll do is we'll capture all of these and we'll answer them in full in the report, the webinar report, which will be published next week. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Helen.
Okay, thanks for that, Kirsty. And as we move to the last section of our webinar for this afternoon, I'm just going to go through a couple of slides just to give you a very quick update on a big piece of work around the development of recommendations for regional land use partnerships. We won't be taking questions on these slides, but we will be providing links in our webinar report at the end of the series, and you can find more information on our website, and also contact our colleague Harriet Donald, who's been leading on this work, and we'll be pleased to hear from you. So for those of you who are not aware, the proposal for regional land use partnerships was first set out in the Scottish Land Use Strategy, and the Climate Change Act in 2019 brought a new ambition to the proposal. So land use and land use change, as we've been hearing this afternoon, and from your questions, is absolutely crucial to delivering climate change targets, and regional land use partnerships are recognised as being pivotal to driving forward and delivering on the ambition, making it a just transition to a net zero economy. So the Scottish Government's asked the Scottish Land Commission to provide advice and make recommendations on the establishment of these partnerships. We've just published an interim report which sets out our advice, drawing on significant stakeholder support and engagement, as well as external support to make the recommendations that have been identified. We've identified areas where further work is required and where the proposals will need to be developed further. So land use frameworks are intended to enable a collaborative and a more dynamic approach to land use planning, empowering local and regional decision making across the whole of Scotland, with a clear focus on action and delivery on the ground. So the partnerships will drive action at the pace and scale needed to deliver climate and environmental targets, but will also support economic recovery and renewal in a way that supports Scotland's focus on regional economies. So there are potentially a wide range of functions that land use partnerships could take on. We've found from our stakeholder feedback and from our engagement that there's a broad appetite for functions that would help to integrate strategic planning across different sectors. And we see a potentially significant evolution for partnerships to take on further functions, and are proposing flexibility for this to happen at a varied pace in different areas, and the core functions are set out in the slide here for engaging and developing regional land use framework that sets out how land use will deliver both local and national priorities, using the framework to prioritise public funding streams and attract other sorts of finance to support delivery, which will be important as well for those of you who are asking about incentives for how land use is prioritised. A focal point for collaboration, providing a brokerage function to support delivery through land managers, communities, businesses and third sector groups, monitoring and evaluating development and delivery of the regional land use framework, and providing advice to government on effective delivery of land use policy. So in the 2019 programme for government, the government committed to establishing regional land use partnerships in 2021, with an expectation that these would be phased in to be operating in all parts of Scotland by 2023. So the interim report is being developed and published just now. Harriet is still happy to take comments on that over the next couple of days, and then over the next few months we will continue to be engaging widely on what the partnerships should look like before a final report to ministers early next year. So once established, they'll help to provide a voice at regional level and to long-term strategic decisions about the way land is used, directly supporting more local decisions about the principles and issues that we've been discussing today. So lots to look forward to in watching this piece of work coming forward. Finally, I want to tell you about two more immediate opportunities for you to help you on your journeys in putting land rights and responsibilities into practice. The first is about our land rights and responsibilities self-assessments. We're currently running a pilot program to test out a self-assessment program which stems initially from our investigation into the impacts of scale and concentration on rural land ownership. One of the recommendations from that research was the introductory of statutory reviews to ensure better accountability of land holdings in relation to the 6 land rights and responsibility principles that we've been talking about today. Ministers have agreed that we should do further work to develop how such reviews have been taken forward. So before we make our recommendations, before we frame our recommendations for the statutory review process, we're starting to review how it could be done on a voluntary basis, and have developed a short self-assessment framework to help anyone who makes significant decisions about the way land or buildings are used in either urban or rural areas to assess how they contribute to the principles. We're working with several owners of land across Scotland already in a range of different sectors, and we're keen to get as wide a selection as possible to help test this out. So opportunities include evaluating your own operations and governance, identifying good practice that can be shared with others, identifying areas for improvement, and we can also provide feedback. And you can provide feedback to us as well and influence how the work is taken forward. So if you're interested, note this on the feedback form that you'll get at the end of this webinar, or get in touch with us directly to find out more. The other offer we have for you now is for free online tailored workshops to interested organisations. And Gemma mentioned earlier that before COVID, we were starting a really good programme of running these workshops face-to-face in the days when we still did those things with land agents across Scotland. And we really recognise how beneficial it is to take time out to reflect on good practice and to have those discussions in-house. So we can offer, we're now moving those online, and we can offer workshops that are designed with you, that allow you the opportunity to discuss specific cases and examples in your own organisation's context and to discuss practical guidance. So the workshops can cover an overview of all the Commission's work. We can go into more practical detail about the protocol series that we've been talking about through this webinar. And detailed discussions on any particular areas of interest. So again, get in contact with us or tell us in your feedback form if you'd be interested in running one of these with us with your own organisation. So that brings us to an end for this afternoon. So finally, thank you all for joining myself and my Good Practice Team colleagues today. We hope you found the webinar informative and useful. Your feedback is really important to us, so please do complete the form, the short form that you'll get emailed to you at the end of the webinar. And please do get in contact if you need more information, if you're interested in the self-assessment or the workshops, or if you have a particular query that you think we may be able to help with. Our contact details are here, and you can also contact us through details on our website. It's been a real pleasure to present to you all today, and good luck to all of you on your land rights and responsibilities journeys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.